Welcome back to Impact House Chicago. I'm here with Kristi Ross, my co-host for our finale today. And in a moment, we'll be joined by Moran Cerf, my colleague at Northwestern University, everybody's favorite neuroscientist. Let's bring Moran onto the screen with us. Moran, how are you doing?
Wonderful. It's been a hectic morning, but I'm glad that I'm settled and it looks like I'm totally not stressed.
Yeah, you actually look great. In fact, so for everybody's information, Moran tried frantically to get here from New York City last night and this morning, and eventually had to give up. So I suppose that's emblematic of the challenges we face, but fortunately technology has come to our rescue this time because your feed looks great. You need a shave, but otherwise you look great. So our purpose here is to, you guys are proxies. Your proxies for our Twinians who are watching in cyberspace and all of our live stream. They've gone off into these delegate conversations or looked at our study guide and what were we taking. So what are your impressions? And I'll start, Kristi, with you since you're here in the studio.
Sure, and looking across all of these interviews and all of this information, I'm sort of trying to tie all of this together, right? And so I'm going to start with a comment that Navi shared on what went right during the pandemic.
Right.
And that was, more solidarity and more sharing of information and all of that. And more sharing of more information, really just a function, but it also sparked collaboration, which of course we all know leads to innovation. But the thing that I think was interesting is to say this simplistically, sharing information, requires data. It requires access. It requires security. And you start to pull all of those things together. And for it to work well, that really each link in that chain needs to be strong. And so it really sort of highlights for me as well, the vulnerability of something not actually working or coming together without all of us pulling together to make that happen.
Right. I mean, just to build on that a little bit, I didn't appreciate when we started planning Twin Tech how different not just the technology or building the program would be, but the design of the program, the structure of it, doing the pre-records, editing them down to an amount of time that would fit into the flow, dealing with the delegate, the live stream, all these things. And beyond technology, really everything about this convening is different than past convenings. Right. Everything about it, except there are human beings involved.
Right, but actually connecting in the same way. You can't quite do it the same way. So you have to really be far more cognizant of making that deeper connection.
Absolutely. And speaking of in the same way, even though Kristi and I are here in the studio, we are just over 6 feet apart. So by the way, we're fully compliant with CDC and we've worked really hard to do this. We are just over 6 feet apart. And that's something before the pandemic we wouldn't have thought about.
Right.
At all. So Moran, what is something that has struck you from the program so far today?
A couple of things. I'll try to be really, really brief. So one thing that I noticed that came up again and again had to do with the AI and how superior it is. And it was mentioned in the conversation with Lee Che when he spoke about AlphaGo. One thing that I think it was not mentioned that I really think is important for us to notice is one advantage that machines have on us is that AlphaGo, for example, could play against itself. So if you want to train on playing chess, you can be a really good player.
I don't know, Moran. I know a lot of people who play against themselves all the time. But, yeah.
At least in chess, it's really, really hard to play chess or to play AlphaGo. So we need each other. So the point is that it's not just that there are power in many, many brains. You need to be able to not have the same brain play the 2 roles. And computers can actually forget the other side. So they can make a move, forget their side, and play the other one. And in many ways, I think this is one thing that's interesting about society. We not only depend on each other to have multiple brains, but we also depend on each other to have not the same brain. And in that sense, I think that there's an advantage here to having crowd think about problems together. So this is one thought that came again and again in multiple talks. The other one I thought was relevant when it comes to the conversation about the plants with Lee is that what he alluded to, and I think it's something that we're learning more and more, many times we plan for one thing, a pandemic or an event comes and changes course, and then we learn something else, and in doing that, we actually do a better job. So in many ways, a lot of medicine was an attempt to get at one thing that ended up at another. The best example I could think of is Viagra. Viagra was not supposed to be an erectile dysfunction drug. It was supposed to be a heart disorder solution. But as it turns out, in clinical trials, most participants are male students. Those are the ones that are doing everything for $20. And most people that are actually administering the tests are nurses that are female. And the consequence of having an erection while the study was happening was an unintended event that had to fight us the big successes. So in many ways, I think that the idea of the plant research here is that we have tons of things that we already know, that already work, but they're made for one thing. An event that kind of stirs the pot could teach us that the same thing could work for something totally different.
Right, and I'll build on that. Even the prosaic experience of taping an interview like I did with Dmitry Alperovich. Normally in an event, you'd have the interview and que sera, sera over a limited period of time. But Dmitry and I spoke for almost an hour, and we were able to go back and carve it up. So we could do pre-recordings before. We could do web conferences before, but nobody did because it wasn't as good. Now we're foisted into this, and we're learning really fast. Not as fast as I would like, but we're learning really fast.
Right.
So any thoughts about anything else that struck you, Kristi?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I think one of the things that Lee and Jenny had said was, you know, we've from Livongo that we've crossed that first digital Rubicon, but now we need to take that next step in making the pathways more personalized. And but what and how you do that is you have to get that data, and people have to be willing to give that data. So that concept of give to get is really important, but also I think that people are far more apt to give that kind of information when they're getting something that is helpful to them and very specific to them, which I think is so critical. That just everything's been solved for the masses before, right? And really now I feel like we're sort of flipping the coin and saying, no, we need to actually look at this at a very personalized level.
So I love this because one of the things we're trending to in this session next is complex systems. So we're going to be talking to David Krakauer from Santa Fe Institute about complexity theory, collective decision making. And one of the things he talks about is a lot of the psychology, neuroscience has looked at individuals, less so at collectives. And this is where complexity comes in. So your point is we can become more personalized for each individual, provide more value, but then we also have to think back to the broader perspective as how each of those individual decisions roll up into this collective. And we haven't encountered this before in history the way we are now. Moran, any thoughts about, from a neuroscience perspective, about collective decision making?
Yeah, so I'll build 2 points on what you and Kristi just said.
Please.
One thing is that I agree. People need to share their data for the greater good. Collective information leads to collective decisions, and it leads to better solutions for everyone else. A lot of people, and this is where I tie it to Dmitry's work, are worried that if they share their data, they're going to basically be spotted on and identified. And the reality is that there's more and more research on differential algorithms that basically allow you to share your data in a way that it's still used by this kind of entity that looks at the information and keeps you anonymized. So in a way, we're aiming towards a solution that will do the things that Dmitry spoke about with the thing that Kristi just spoke about. Allow you to share information and not lose your information. And I want to say one last thing about what Dmitry said that is important. There's one thing that I think we should say on security, and I'm speaking now as a former hacker and as a current neuroscientist. Yeah. Most hacks, despite all the stories we're being told, are not the ones we imagine where someone sits in their basement and kind of figures out the password and so on. It's actually someone giving you the password by phone. You just call them and you say, I really need it, and they give it to you. Most hacks, over 90%, are not someone doing something smart, but just calling the right person at the right time, or a disgruntled employee giving the password and so on. So in many ways, the problem we need to solve isn't just the problem of cybersecurity as a solution by companies like CrowdStrike solving the security of the system, but also psychologists, neuroscientists helping us know how to answer the question at the right time, how not to let stress give things and so on, how to think of security as something that helps us all rather than something that I just do without paying attention to.
Yeah, the human element of it, right?
Yeah,
the human element.
Well, we create all the problems and create all the solutions.
Yes.
I mean, this is ours to make.
In that order.
In that order, yeah. And that's a fact. I actually believe philosophically that humans need problems. We thrive on those. And please don't take that the wrong way. Humans thrive on problems. So thank you for this. This is great. We're going to come back again for another conversation like this a little bit later on. But as we go to break, and this break, by the way, feel free to use as a break, or any of our delegates, feel free to go and find a delegate conversation space or a one-on-one conversation, maybe even go to networking to see who else is on board. And everyone in the live stream, during this, we'll be sharing photos from Twinian Al Landry, retired Colonel Al Landry, who's also a phenomenal photographer. And so during our break, we're going to share a bunch of photos that Al Landry gave to us that he has been posting through the pandemic. Al decided that there was too much negative news, too much heaviness in the air. And so he decided a few months ago, every day, I'm going to post on my Facebook account a picture of nature. And he's just knocked it out of the park. Thanks to Al Landry, thanks Kristi and Moran, and we'll see you in a little bit.